Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. Today we've got, as always, an interesting topic around biodynamics. And in particular, we'll probably start off with breathwork, but this is a little bit more general of a topic, basically just using biological movement as a modality for working with trauma, working with the body in general. And yeah, so that's the topic for today. What do you know of biodynamics, Nick? Where have you come across this term, and what do you know about it?
The term itself is quite popular in Germany, I would say. It's mentioned a lot in German alternative psychology. We have, I think, two figures that are famously have been practicing it and developing it. One is Rudolf Steiner, who, this is the whole school of, what is the name of the alternative schooling system that came out of it? Waldorf schools. Is that have you ever heard of that?
Yeah, we have Waldorf schools around here. That's interesting.
Yeah. So then you can imagine, it kind of comes out of that specific esoteric frame, let's say. And then on the other hand, we have Wilhelm Reich, who's also a famous esoteric, let's say. But specifically, I started reading one book of his because I was very interested in this idea of body armoring. It just felt very logical to me, or very correct, the way that he describes this body armoring, because this was something that I experienced in my own body. Like, I have a lot of stiff muscles, and as I was developing body awareness, I couldn't shake off that image of, it definitely feels literally like armoring that is like slowly loosening up. And so I was like, if he knew that already 100 years ago, he was kind of onto something. So I started reading into it a little bit, and then he has these, what you mentioned earlier, these 7 bands of armoring on the body. But so I focused on the one that was kind of relevant for me, which was the neck one, and I read a little bit also about the one around the eye area, let's say. And I think actually that's the one I need to do some more explorations into, because that's actually where I still feel some stiffness. And this is also where I notice that other people hold a lot of stiffness, because that's the one that you can see the easiest. If there's like a little bit of a cramping of the face, or if people tend to make a lot of expressions with their forehead and so on, that usually indicates that there's some armoring going on. And then the third person is, I think his name is Alexander Lowe, who it's a bit more recent, like in the 20th century, developed some biodynamic exercises, for opening up the throat, the body, and so on. So I'm very interested, but my knowledge is somewhat still shallow. So where are you with it at the moment? What are you reading into?
Yeah. So I recently started this course called Biodynamic Breathwork. It's by, I guess he's a Ukrainian named Gitin Tonkev or something like that. Yeah, and I'd come across him a number of times just kind of in the breathwork community, and decided to sign up for an online kind of self-study course that he has, where he kind of guides you through basically using conscious connected breathing and self-massage and movement to kind of reinvigorate, or I guess you'd say kind of bring the felt sense back to different parts of our body that have become numb over the years, right? And it really resonated with me in particular because I've been on breathwork kick for quite some time now and have been finding very similar things. Like one of the things he talks about a lot is how the breathwork can kind of elicit like undulations or movements or tremors, right? But in particular, this word undulation really sticks with me because I'd started with like the TRE, the tremoring, a while ago, and kind of, I guess, in combination or kind of synergy, you could say, with my Tai Chi practice, it kind of started to turn into more of an undulation than like an actual tremoring. And it's really interesting because it does seem to start from the center of the body and kind of radiate out towards the periphery. And so you kind of get like these it's almost like a shock that kind of happens in the center of your body, and then it kind of like radiates out, and it brings along with it sort of this wave-like movement, almost like pop and lock kind of, dancing or something, right? And it's kind of along with it starts to bring more awareness. It starts to bring more feeling into different parts of the body that were maybe otherwise, like you were saying, rigid or have become really stiff and just aren't really moving anymore. And honestly, I've kind of seen that overall as almost kind of an overarching theme or goal in so much of the work that we talk about, whether it be meditation, breath work, any other modalities, where really it's almost like the body is kind of like a memory in a sense, I guess you could say. And this rigidity in the body is, I don't know, kind of stuckness, kind of rigidity that also shows up on the psychological level, right? It can be like having a really hard time doing something, or in certain situations you really struggle, that there might be a corollary to that somewhere in the body where there's some stiffness has developed. And if you can work through that, then your experience of the world will actually start to change just by working with the body and working with this rigidity and bringing more movement into the body and more aliveness and awareness. So that's kind of where I'm at with it. And I've been finding it to be really interesting, really, I'd say pretty useful. I mean, I'm kind of at very, very beginning stages of exploring some of this stuff more in depth from this perspective, but I've found it really useful. Have you done any sort of like biodynamic type modalities? Have you done any sort of work or breath work around this, or does it resonate with you?
I haven't done anything yet. I'm really interested in it. Just like I haven't had an opportunity to do something guided by anybody. In what sense would you say it is different than the, let's say, regular breath work that you have done before? Is it just the knowledge behind it, or is there really a difference in like practically how you do it?
I would say a little bit of both. So the knowledge behind it, you're kind of looking at it from a little bit of a different framework. I would say with a lot of the breath work, so I've learned it from a number of different people, and generally it hasn't had too much of like a philosophical backing. It's generally been more of like just breathe like this, kind of allow, so to describe the type of breath work, it's kind of intense, it's connected, meaning that you eliminate the pauses. You do tend to emphasize the inhale. In some schools, some of them kind of have the inhale and exhale fairly even, but for the most part, you kind of want to avoid totally exhaling because you end up getting like tetany and other kind of side effects. But in any case, generally the instruction has just been, do this type of intense breathing and allow whatever comes out to come out. Whereas in the more kind of biodynamic oriented frameworks, there's a lot more intentional movement. There's a lot more focused, like self-massage, for example. So like in this biodynamic breath work that I'm taking right now, you work through these different bands that you were mentioning, and it's sort of like a top down. So you start with the band that's kind of the top of the head and the eyes, and then you move down to like, I think probably the jaw and the neck. And I haven't gone through all of them yet, so I'm not sure the different divisions of the bands, but it's really a lot more focused, I would say. And the other forms that I've worked with before are a lot more open, kind of like just breathe this way and whatever happens, happens. They might give you a few little practical tips as far as how to work with tetany and such when it comes up, but it's not very directed. Whereas in the biodynamic ones that I've worked with, at least, they're a lot more focused on, okay, let's focus on this very specific part of the body, breathe in this way. And I guess one other thing that I've found to be a pretty significant difference, and I think is actually a really important aspect of like the biodynamic breath work, and that's cycling or pendulation, very similar to like what Peter Levine talks about, where basically you spend 2 or 3 minutes breathing in this conscious, connected, a little bit more intense, focusing on certain areas of the body. And then you kind of like slow it down. You allow that to kind of calm down. And then you just kind of sit with the sensations. And then you might also move your awareness to points of safety within the body or externally, right? So you have that resource in particular, and you're really kind of pendulating, or you're cycling between doing some of the more intense breath work, focusing on those parts of the body, cycling through like maybe doing a little bit of self-touch and kind of slowing down that breath work, and then also kind of bringing in that resourcing, bringing in that sense of safety, and then you repeat, and you keep going through these cycles. And the idea is, kind of in contrast, one of the big contrasts I would say between this more intense type of, I would call it maybe undirected, conscious connected breathing, and the more biodynamic is you're really focusing on trying to aliven certain areas, but you're also doing it in a much more, I would say, methodical way, in the sense that you kind of, you breathe intensely to create this activation, which is kind of like a feeling of tingling, right? And then you want to maintain that activation. And you want to maintain it in such a way that it doesn't become overwhelming, right? And so this is one of the main differences. With the other types of breath work, the more undirected, there is a tendency to kind of just keep pushing, even if it becomes a little bit overwhelming. And then that can kind of create some more psychedelic type effects, and it can be a little bit more disorienting, I would say. So those are some of the, I know I just dropped a lot right there, but those are some of the main differences that I've seen.
Yeah. When you say you focus on certain areas, you mean that you bring, let's say, your internal focus on that area of the body, right? Or do you do some kind of physical exercise with that part of the body?
Yeah, so a little bit of both. So, for example, with the band of the upper head and the eyes, you will actually move the eyes. So there are a lot of, like moving the eyes around kind of like in a circle, or left and right in particular, which really reminds me a lot of EMDR, right? Like the eye movement desensitization, reprogramming. And so I think, just honestly, just in intentionally moving that part of the body a little bit, you're going to draw your attention there. I mean, you kind of have to, right? So if you're moving your eyes back and forth, your attention is, and your awareness is really going to be focused on that area anyways. But you're kind of just cycling through a few different things. So some intentional movement, some of the conscious connected breath work, and then also kind of paying attention to the level of activation to kind of maintain that at a manageable level. Right. And then also inviting in that resourcing, inviting in that those places of the body that feel safe. Right. So in a sense, you're kind of like awakening this feeling of aliveness in the body, and then just kind of being with it and acclimating to it, and then cycling and doing it again and acclimating to it. And it seems really useful so far for me.
Mm-hmm. This element of paying conscious attention to certain body parts, that's also something you do usually in a body scan meditation. And I was thinking about that, why that is effective in any way, because, what does that do? Like, also sometimes in certain breath works, they tell you like, okay, and now breathe into your stomach. That still makes sense because, kind of expanding. But then they're saying, breathe into your limbs, breathe into your hands, breathe into, certain areas. And that often didn't really connect with me. I didn't understand, like, what do they mean by that? But I don't think that we can necessarily, direct the flow of oxygen, to certain body parts. But something interesting does happen when we focus on internal attention into some parts of our body. And I'm not really sure what, but my speculation is that it's just that we are bringing the awareness and kind of the nerve input that we have there back online, in case they have been offline, which then in turn brings, more input and more awareness. And that kind of checks out because it somehow the body seems to have an active role in awareness and in consciousness. And I don't know exactly how it works, but what I definitely notice is that if I have certain parts of my body stiff and locked, I almost feel like my awareness is fogged to some degree, right? And especially like since the problem I'm dealing with is usually like my neck and my spine, that in particular feels, I feel clogged or I feel brain fog. I feel less aware. And then, let's say after doing yoga or Kundalini yoga or something like that, I feel bodily very open, but also in my awareness really open and, I don't know, flowy or accessible. So that's an interesting observation in general, I think. So yeah, do you think that in what way do you think is our mind and our awareness connected to in what shape our body is?
Yeah, so I think, one way that you could look at it is it's almost like the entire body is a sensing organ, right? Like there's information that we're getting from, say, the external world in every inch of our body has some sort of capacity for sensation. And I think what happens is, we go through traumatic experiences, and during those traumatic experiences, there are certain parts of the body that are probably more active than other parts of the body, depending upon, how we're being stimulated, right? And when we try to make those experiences stop because they're overwhelming, the way that we do that is by numbing our awareness to different parts of our body. And then they kind of start becoming stiff, and then we kind of lose access to the information that part of the body can give us, right? And so in a sense, it really is reducing our awareness, right? And in a way, even activities like thinking can be more of a full body activity, right? I mean, we tend to think of thinking as you're sitting down at a desk and it's all happening in your mind, but there are, physical aspects to thinking, right? And a lot of times, I mean, we can notice this anecdotally. If we're stuck on a particular problem, it can really help to move the body, to get out, do a little exercise or something that can really, help open up our awareness and help our mind kind of work through problems. So I guess that's kind of the way that I look at it as far as, the connection between, our conscious awareness and our ability to sense in our body. And one of the things that came up in the biodynamic breathwork class that I thought was really good is the teacher mentions that, if we have a lot of trauma, there is a tendency to have a little bit more of tunnel vision. And so you actually lose some of your peripheral vision. And in some of the first exercises where you're kind of rolling your eyes around the periphery and just kind of exploring that, one of the things that he mentions is to pay particular attention to areas where your vision is a little bit more, where your eye doesn't necessarily want to go there, right? So even if you're just doing it, listeners, whoever else, if you want to do this, Nik, too, just kind of move your eyes around the outside of your vision and notice how it kind of moves a little bit jerky. Like there are kind of points. And, it depends a little bit on what you're looking at, but notice if you can move it smoothly all the way around. And there might be a correlation between different areas where it's harder to move your eyes smoothly and potentially trauma that you experienced in the past. Like maybe you were looking a certain direction. Maybe you saw something out of the corner of, the right side of your eye. And now your vision is a little bit reduced in that area, right? Your awareness is reduced and your eyes have a tendency to not want to go there, right? And so in a way, this is kind of bring that awareness back.
Yeah, I definitely have one or two points where it is jerky and like where my eyes are automatically like avoiding certain bits of my vision. Yeah, and I also think that we have that this stiffness in the body leads to also asymmetry in the body. That's also something I notice a lot with myself and also with other people, that we are somehow asymmetric, and I think that then in turn then can have an impact on other parts of the body. So let's say you have developed stiffness only in one part of your body, but then your body needs to adapt to that kind of bodily malformation, and it needs to compensate, right? So, and for that compensation, I think this can then trigger again different problems in different parts of the body. So yeah, it's interesting how the body is taking care of a small thing, of shutting down our awareness of a certain thing, protecting us from that, but in turn creates this complex compensation that can, I think, lead to many times misleading physical symptoms. Yeah. So you have something with your neck, and then you have like digestive issues that doesn't logically check out, but I can't imagine how your musculature adapting to something you don't want to become aware of with your shoulder or your neck, can lead to digestive problems. And yeah, I don't know if there's a system to trace these backs, but I know it's definitely like helpful to start loosening those rigidities up, right? I mean, it feels very, very positive. But it also brings sensitivity, and this is something that you mentioned like before we started recording. I think that's kind of an interesting point, because this is for mindfulness, for example, which is something I have a lot to do with because of my work. We talk a lot about it, and there's not many angles in which you can critique mindfulness in a way it's like useful for people. But one thing that people consistently bring up for mindfulness, or a problem with it, is that it increases people's sensitivity, and that this is in some way like a problem, because I don't know, people don't want to. I guess people don't want to feel that much, but you become sensitive or perhaps maybe anxious even, right? Because now you're suddenly aware of so much. You're sensitive, I guess. I don't need to explain the word, but yeah, do you see a problem with sensitivity? Like, would that even be a negative trait for you, or is that something you would be looking for when doing these practices?
Yeah, I think the way that it shows up as something that's potentially negative, or you could interpret it as negative, is because it's bringing awareness to something that we're really uncomfortable with, right? I think that's kind of what puts a lot of people off. Like, for example, meditation, one of the most common kind of complaints or issues with it is just that it seems to make all of my problems worse, or my anxiety's gotten worse. And it's not necessarily that these things are getting worse, but it's that your awareness of them is increasing. And so relatively speaking, it's, now occupying a greater amount of your awareness, and it seems bigger and it seems worse. But I would actually say that kind of that discomfort that's coming up could be seen, or you could use it as a catalyst to keep you going, because really that discomfort, I would say, is kind of habitual, and I'd say kind of dysfunction or misinterpretation. There's another word that we use, incorrect or dysfunctional proprioception, right? It's something essentially that we've learned that's uncomfortable. And when we bring awareness back to it, that interpretation of this is uncomfortable then comes back to the surface. And I would say that this is potentially a beneficial thing, because it's an incorrect interpretation. And there's an opportunity, if you practice something like surrender and letting go, to allow that interpretation to sort of dissolve. And then the raw information of what's actually there in those sensations can kind of come forward. And there's really good information there potentially, but we're habitually misinterpreting what's there. And so it's kind of uncomfortable to awaken that sensitivity. I've found over time, initially that sensitivity can be really uncomfortable, but over time, once you kind of integrate it, it becomes much more natural, and it sort of loses the tinge of discomfort, and it becomes kind of just another source of information, just a greater sense, right? Greater sensitivity in general. And it's not, it doesn't necessarily bother you once you've acclimated to it and integrated it.
Yeah, once you acclimate to it, it's usually not the problem. I think that the problem is the first time you feel that part of the body again. So I imagine it as, let's say, all the nerve endings we have in our body, once some, let's say, rigidity happens there, and we sort of just, it goes down from the system. We don't have awareness of it anymore. So when we sit down and we meditate, or, for stronger rigidities, if we do like breath work, what you're describing, then we have the opportunity to, bring them back online, and now they're, giving signal again. The problem is that the reason why those nerve endings went offline is because they were giving us input that we don't like, so that we kind of declined, or that we have some resistance towards, basically. That's usually, right, that's how apparently our body also has some intelligence of protecting us, or we have a way to also decline our body. And I think this is generally very true, because I know that a lot of people are not living in their body at all. They're perhaps only living in their head. They're not aware of like what is happening in their body. We know anecdotally at least, and we know people for which this is very true. So when these nerve endings come back online, now we have to deal first with whatever it was that we rejected when that part of the body went offline, right? And that's why it can be things, like you mentioned, from a trauma at worst, right? But it doesn't have to be always from traumatic experiences. It can be just stuff we don't like and that we in general decline. So stuff like, I don't know, anxiety, shame, whatever negative emotions there is. But once we feel through whatever that feeling or that emotion is, that channel, that nerve ending becomes free again to receive now new information. The new information doesn't have to be always the negative ones. So then once we went through the process, we are literally like, we are 1 point more aware now, and we have more resolution to the experience. And yeah, that's kind of what it feels like.
Yeah. I think that's pretty accurate, and I would totally agree. I think that it's maybe a little bit unfortunate that it's uncomfortable to go through that process, but gonna quote Michael Singer here. He says, that stuff was stored with pain, and it's gonna come up with pain, but it's well worth it to go through that, because otherwise, we're kind of silently suffering the same thing over and over again, and it's still affecting us, right? Even if we're not aware of it, it's still affecting us, and it's really handicapping us, because we're not able to show up in the world the way that we really want to, right? We end up, getting triggered by things. We end up getting upset when we really don't want to get upset, right? And then it's hard to do the things that you want to do out in the world when your emotions aren't cooperating in a way, when your feelings aren't cooperating. And so this is a way to work through that, and to kind of, it's almost a way of like deprogramming ourselves. I would say, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, that this rigidity, if you want to refer to it that way, in the body is almost like that's where our programming lies. That's how we've become robotic in the way that we respond to the world, is because when we're stimulated a certain way, and then this misinterpretation happens and it's uncomfortable, then that causes us to be repelled by whatever caused that stimulation, perhaps unnecessarily, right? And perhaps against our own personal interests, right? So I see this really as like a path to freedom, right? And freedom through the body, in a sense, and I found that to be accurate. And so it's a really powerful way to work through it. And this is, one of the reasons why I think the idea and utilizing this idea of pendulation and cycling when when we're actually activating these things is really, really important, because that's what really facilitates the integration, is cycling through like the higher level of activation, kind of sitting with it, witnessing it, and then also, coming back to the resources, coming back to the places where you feel safe. And that way you're kind of starting to bridge that gap, and you're kind of almost inviting integration. Whereas some of the other types of breath work that don't necessarily have that aspect as much, I think they tend to be much more difficult to integrate, right? I'd kind of liken them more to a psychedelic trip where you're kind of on a roller coaster and you can't really get off. And sometimes it's just so overwhelming, and there's just almost too much information or too much stimulation, and you just can't really integrate it. You're just kind of like, well, I just have to hold on,
What to do, like how to make progress there? So in my experience, I often have a problem with, accessing certain parts. So I know that some parts, like, they feel stiff, and I would like them to, somehow bring my awareness back to those parts. But it doesn't work always. How do you make progress there?
Yeah, I think, once we're really familiar with the process, we can kind of allow our bodies and our beings to kind of guide it intuitively. But when we're kind of new to it, I think it really helps to follow a formula, follow a direction. So I think it does make sense to kind of do, like, as far as the body's concerned, a top-down type approach. And the reason that I think that, and I honestly don't know, this isn't like experiential knowledge here, is that I think it's a much gentler approach, because when you're starting at the bottom, when you're starting at like your, look at it from the perspective of the chakras, right? When you're starting at the root chakra, and from the perspective of Kundalini, that's where most of the energy is already, right? And if you're just kind of moving up and opening things up, that energy is going to be coming up very, very powerfully. And it's going to start pushing on whatever's above it each time you kind of open up and move up a level. Whereas if you start from the top, there's not a lot of pressure there already. And you're just kind of opening things up and moving down towards where that pressure comes from. So that's just kind of an aside, just kind of a thought as far as what direction you might move. But I would say in general, it's very helpful to just kind of follow a bit of a formula. So, maybe that's top down, starting with the head, working with that for a little while and allowing it to integrate. And it doesn't necessarily look big. It doesn't necessarily have significant, it won't necessarily cause huge changes immediately. And so you kind of just want to be patient with the process. And let's see, I had another thought around kind of how to work through it. Oh, okay, so also one of the things, especially if you're trying to work on a specific area, say like around the heart, and it just feels really stuck, and you really want to get through that stuck feeling, but no matter how much focus and breath you put into that area, it doesn't seem to want to move. There's this idea, I'd call it kind of like constellations, or like deferred pain, deferred rigidity, you could say. And so it's almost as if, say you're working with the heart area and it feels really stuck, really tight. There might be other areas, like in your periphery. It could be like rigidity in your hands, rigidity in your shoulders, or in other parts of your body, where if you work through that first, it'll actually help loosen up that heart area, for example, right? So I kind of call them like constellations of pain or something. So maybe you've got a really bad, really tight pain somewhere. There are other places throughout your body where it's also showing up, and you might be able to work with those other places to loosen up that one main place. So that's kind of another approach that you can take. And that's why I think something like a body scan type approach is really valuable, because even if you don't know those other places that are part of the constellation, inevitably you'll hit them if you're going through like a body scan. So that's kind of the approach that I would take, or I've found useful, especially when you're finding certain areas feel really stuck.
Yeah, since you mentioned the Kundalini approach to this, what is interesting is that we have these different ways of looking and seemingly tackling the same problem. Because in a way, like what people in Kundalini yoga do is also they try to free up the rigidity specifically around the spine, and they have this specific framework like you mentioned, going along the chakras and so on, and trying to describe how to make the spine open enough so that Shakti can flow through. So yeah, it's cool that there's these different systems that we can use as tools to unlock the body. I think it's just, described from different people, from different perspectives, from different cultures, from different times. But at the end of the day, they're almost doing the same thing. So, it's like a toolbox we have that we can use for the problem of how do we loosen and open up the body. What also helps me is doing progressive muscle relaxation. That kind of works in the sense that if you have a muscle or a body part that is tight, first increasing it to the point of where it cannot hold the tension anymore, that usually works in decreasing tension in a certain body part. And also this like nonlinear movement. That really helps, like, not approaching, because nonlinear movement is kind of the opposite of a structured way of approaching something. And it's just like, yeah, okay, let me see, like, how can I shake my body? How can I loosen my body by itself somehow, like without overthinking it? That also really helps. But yeah, I also got to say it takes a long time, really, for me, at least sometimes, to loosen up certain body parts. And sometimes I'm wondering, like, how can there be so much tension accumulated? Or what also is an experience is, I do for example, Kundalini yoga practice. I feel really open. I feel really loose. I feel like, oh my God, this is perfect. I have completely opened that body part that is stiff. But then the next day or a couple days later, the stiffness comes back to that body part. So how do you see that? Is this a practice that we need to do on a regular basis in order to maintain looseness in the body? Is there something to be cleared out that just needs to be cleared out once? Or, yeah, basically that.
Of like feeling like you've made progress in a certain area in terms of working with the rigidity and bringing more looseness to it. And then just a few days later, it feels like it's that was pointless. It's all back, right? So yeah, totally relate to that experience. And I would say one of the ways that I've come to look at it, this is just a model that I've kind of developed a little bit and come across. But so looking at it as kind of three layers of our experience, sort of the mental, the psychological, psyche type layer, then the emotional layer, feeling layer, and then the physical layer. And of course, these layers are, there's a lot of overlap. But in any case, just for this, sake of this conversation, dividing it up these three ways. And basically, there's rigidity. Anytime there's rigidity in the system, it appears on all three of these levels, right? So, for example, rigidity in the body, maybe that also shows up as emotional rigidity in terms of I don't want to feel that way, right? So maybe it's neck pain, and maybe it's maybe the emotional corollary is anxiety or something. So I don't want to feel anxiety and I feel neck pain, and these are like two aspects of the same rigidity. And then maybe on the mental level, there's something I don't want to be in a certain situation that brings this up, or I don't want to have certain thoughts or something like that, right? And it's just rigidity showing up on all of these levels. And I think that in order to really work through it, you really have to work through it on all of the levels, right? So, for example, say that you've done some physical exercise and whatnot that's loosened up your neck, and that rigidity is a little bit gone. But now maybe the anxiety is coming up, right? And you have to work with that anxiety through something like surrender, where you're essentially saying, kind of reprogramming yourself. Okay, it's okay to feel anxiety. It's okay to feel anxiety. This is just another thing that I can feel, and kind of starting to drop that resistance to it. And I think that's the way that you progress. I think if you don't drop the sort of say emotional resistance and mental resistance, then eventually that re-manifests in the body as that neck pain, for example, right? So once you've worked at it and loosened it up on one layer, the other layers will become a little bit more active. And I think you also have to work with those other layers. Otherwise, eventually it'll sort of like redeposit that rigidity back in the body, for example.
Interesting. I think this is a super important point to consider in all of these practices, because I think these practices can actually help resolve trauma. For example, like let's take trauma because it's the most difficult of all of the things you need to integrate is trauma. And I observe different practices for resolving trauma, like, I don't know, through conversation, behavioral therapy, all of these body work exercises and so on. And yeah, I think it's an interesting point to understand what is needed for a trauma to be resolved, so to speak, because I think we can speak about resolving it, or we could speak about releasing. And there's these different practices, and they seem to all of them seem to aim for a different part of the three layers that you mentioned. So the conversational therapy thing, aims for just the mind part, and they have this idea that you need to re-experience the thing. You need to go back and you need to somehow reframe it and then store it as a different memory. Then you have other practices where, release therapy, where it's about you should feel just the attached emotions or the stuck emotions. And then you have body practices like, I don't know, yoga or some breathworks, where you should just focus on the body part. But how would a holistic way of actually resolving and releasing it on all layers at the same time look like, from your perspective, if you even think that's possible?
Oh yeah, definitely. And honestly, I'm very passionate about, I'd like to, and I kind of have a fantasy around developing a program that integrates so many of these different practices, and, just from my own experiences and what I've found work. So yeah, very, very interested in this topic of like, okay, how do we do it now? And I also agree when it comes to other modalities that are really only focusing on one of these layers. It's, I would argue, one of the reasons why sometimes they're unsuccessful or they're only partially successful, because they're kind of ignoring these other aspects to some degree, right? I mean, you could say that if you're trying to re-experience something, you are going to be experiencing it like on a physical and emotional level. And so as long as you kind of are able to surrender and integrate all of those different levels, I do think it's very helpful to like create a mental construct, a framework where you delineate these different levels so that you can really recognize and kind of tease them apart. I mean, in a sense, that's one of the reasons something like Buddhism is effective, because it's deconstructing our experience, right? And that can really help you see things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to see. But in any case, to kind of answer your question, what a therapy that integrates all these things would look like is, honestly, I would say it would just be a combination of effective therapies for each layer, right? So it would involve some sort of body work and breath work and bringing awareness to, and developing greater interoception. It would bring more awareness to the body, and with the goal of allowing yourself to eventually feel anything anywhere in the body and be okay with that, right? And then similarly on the emotional level, it's kind of going through and, playing all of the emotional chords in a sense. And it can be either just allowing, your day-to-day life to eventually strike all of the emotional chords in you, or you can intentionally invoke them, right? However, and again, very similarly, allowing yourself to experiencing them and kind of reaching a point where you're okay feeling any emotion. And it's just like, it's just another emotion. And then similarly, on the level of mind, doing something where you're changing your relationship to your thoughts, where essentially you're okay having any thoughts come up and they just really don't bother you, right? They've been integrated in a sense. And so I guess that's kind of like a high level, vague description of what therapy that addresses all three levels might look like. And I would say that one of the great things about kind of this model of working with things at multiple layers is that if one layer feels really, really stuck, like if you're really, really hung up on the story, that went with this, or maybe you're like, I do not want to experience that emotion ever again, right? If you're really hung up on that, you can work with one of the other layers, right? You can work with the body. And after a while of working with the body and loosening things up, you might be able to revisit that emotion and find that, oh, actually, maybe I could work with this. Maybe I'm a little bit more okay with it than I was before. And you didn't even necessarily interact with it directly, but rather you worked on one of those other layers.
I think what's important is that whatever that practice will be, it should include those three layers. And actually, I'm not even sure, if those are the only layers that should be addressed. This is probably also worth exploring if there's like even something more. For example, if I don't know, intuition, is even a separate layer, or if it's like part of one of the three layers. But definitely some kind of practice that involves all three of them. And I think when we approach things that are as difficult as trauma, while it sounds simple, to just imagine being present on those three levels at the same time, which is, I guess, what meditation is to some degree, right? Yeah. You're trying to be open to whatever input comes from any of these layers. But if things come where we have a lot of resistance towards, or that are very difficult, it is almost magical how our mind or our body is able to either dissociate, or distract us, or draw us into the story around it, so that we are not able to go on the feeling level. So I guess the best thing that we can do is become very skillful at not escaping, not dissociating, either from the body or from the mind, particularly for the emotions. So some kind of targeted practice of, how can we not have any resistance towards any of the awareness spectrum, and only then when we become practiced in it, we could start facing more difficult issues, more deeper sitting issues. But it will actually be interesting to kind of, start giving this some kind of a framework and naming.
Yeah. And I think, especially when it comes to working with deeper traumas, and honestly, I would argue that we all have some degrees of trauma, or some degrees that are going to be, some things that are going to be really challenging for us to work with. So even if you don't think that you've had, very explicit trauma in the past, kind of just giving yourself a little bit of a grace, a little bit of space, and understanding that once you start engaging in these very intentional practices, they can be destabilizing, right? And that's one of the reasons it's so helpful to use this pendulation method, where you're really only like raising your level of activation to the point where it might be a little bit kind of on the edge of your comfort zone, but you're really not pushing yourself so far over that you're going to kind of cause your nervous system to become dysregulated, because then you're not, like you were saying, then you end up dissociating, and it's really hard to make useful, intentional progress once your nervous system, some sort of survival response is kicked in. Right. And so it is really important to kind of use this very gradual approach. And that's where I think some of the very intentional, sometimes more intense, but very intentional, conscious connected breath work can be very valuable, because it, if you're very methodical about the way that you approach it, you can pretty precisely control the level of activation. It's not like an immediate response. When you start breathing in these more intense ways, it will elicit activation, but it can take a few moments before you actually see the activation and feel the activation, right? So there is a slight lag or delay, you could say, but it is very effective in terms of like a direct control of that activation, right? And so working with the breath in that way gradually building up the activation, bringing awareness to different parts of the body through movement and touch, working with that area, and then, kind of calming down the breath, kind of just witnessing, spending a little bit of time. Okay, now that I've kind of amped this up, what do I feel? What's there? And then calming it back down and kind of regrounding yourself, and then reactivating, and then regrounding. It's kind of this process of cycling through that. That's why I think it's really useful, because then you can also weight it towards one end or the other. If you're working with something really light, maybe you're going to activate yourself a whole lot more. Maybe 90% of your session is activating and 10% is grounding. But if you're working with something that's way more traumatic, maybe you're spending most of your time in the grounding phase, right? And so you can kind of play with this and modify it to your particular needs and to the particular thing that you're working with.
Regarding this pendulation that you mentioned as a way of, I guess, slowing down, using it kind of as a break within the practice, can you give an example of like what do you pendulate to, let's say?
Sure. So usually it's sort of pendulation between the more activating traumatic aspect of your experience and anything that you've been able to establish as a resource or as safety. So, for example, I'm not going to remember her name, but in the book Widen the Window, which is all about using these types of techniques and other techniques to widen your window of tolerance and work with trauma. But in that book, she talks a lot about contact points in particular being really good places for grounding. So, for example, sitting in a chair, maybe your feet are on the floor. Maybe your feet are your resource, or the place where you feel a little bit better in the body. That's kind of what a resource is. And so it's really helpful to establish, your resources before you start activating stuff, right? And so maybe you're working with your neck and anxiety. And so you're breathing into that area. You're kind of really trying to feel it. Maybe you're touching it. And then you've reached a certain level of activation and you're just kind of witnessing it. And then you want to move into that resource or that feeling of safety, And again, honestly, I think that it's important to develop a resource for all three levels. So you want to have like a mental resource. What's your happy thought? What's something that you feel good and safe about having in your mind? What's kind of a happy feeling, and also what's a happy kind of place in the body. And again, the contact points can often be like, those are good places to check, see if that's a resource for you. So you're working with the pain in the neck, you're breathing with it, it's feeling activated, and then you're ready to kind of cool down and ground. So then you shift your focus to your happy thought, your happy emotion, and the safe place in your body. And you spend a little bit of time there until you feel grounded, and then you shift back to that pain, that trauma, reactivate it, and you go back and forth between feelings of safety and kind of the edge of activation.
Nice. That's really useful. I think I will definitely use this the next time I do some breath work. So can you, you were saying that you were doing a course on biodynamic breathwork. Is it something you would recommend? You want to mention it?
Sure, I'll mention it. I haven't gotten very far, so I don't totally know if it's the best thing, but it's called Biodynamic Breathwork and Trauma Release System, BBTRS. Like I said, the guy that came up with it, this guy Gitin Tonkev. Probably not saying that correctly, so apologize for that. But yeah, you can find him. I think you can just search biodynamic breathwork, and I think it'll probably be the top result. Then he's got some online courses. I think he does some in-person stuff as well. But yeah, it's pretty good. It's brought definitely a little bit of a paradigm shift for me in terms of how I've been taught previously. Like I said, it brings in a little bit more of this idea of pendulation and a little bit more directed rather than the kind of undirected breath work that I've done before. But yeah, it's a pretty cool system from what I've seen so far.
Nice. It feels a bit like there's also somewhat of an overlap to somatic experiencing.
Definitely.
Yeah. I mean, all of these practices seem to be schooling people in their awareness of their body in particular, and I think that's always useful. So the more of these types of practices there are there, I think the better. But yeah, nowadays there's really a lot of things you can do. I think if you have stiffness in your body to address it. But yeah, this one is really interesting. I hope I will have the time to also dive into this a bit deeper, as it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, like I was saying, hopefully we'll create our own version of it once we feel, sufficiently. Once we feel like we sufficiently understand it and everything, I'd really like to create something like that. So that would be cool as well.
Yeah, I think the goal with something like that would always be to take it one step further in terms of like how holistic it is. So it's just, if you analyze the other modalities that are there and you realize, okay, there might be a gap, and if you zoom one level out, there's one more thing to consider, like we're doing right now. There's these different modalities that we know that deal with your emotions. There's these ones that we know that deal with your body, the ones that deal just with your thoughts or your memories. Connecting those dots, I think, might be really useful and helpful for the people that are ready for that. So I think it's a really interesting area to explore.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'd say just in general for anyone listening, I'd encourage people to explore all sorts of different, somatic, breath work, even the more kind of mind-oriented approaches, meditation, right? I mean, there's so much overlap. And honestly, every practice that you do will improve all of the other practices because you glean all of these insights into really the essence of what you're doing, which, one of the ways that I would come to put it, if I just put it as generally as possible, is you're just bringing more fluidity into a system that's become rigid, right? Whether you look at that on the level of mind, emotion, body, or any other division, right? Like these are all just ideas, essentially, these different divisions. So if a different set of divisions makes more sense for you, you use that, but be open-minded to all of the different ways that you can look at these things, because they'll, when you see something through a different framework, you'll recognize different patterns, right? So each framework really, it's valuable, right? They each have their own areas where they're really helpful and their own blind spots, and to get the most out of all of them, work with a bunch of different ones. I mean, of course, there are some things out there that are just, maybe a little bit less useful, right? But I think a lot of the main things that you're going to come across in like somatic therapies are going to be pretty useful. So I personally just love exploring and finding different modalities and, gleaning insights from them. It's something that I personally really enjoy.
Yeah, me too, totally. I think so. This rigidity that we hold in our body, it's sort of just a trace of a body and a mind trying to be functional. I think so. We also probably shouldn't, demonize all of these stiffnesses in our body, because at the end of the day, they helped us through difficult situations at times. They keep us working. They keep us performing. They make us good at our jobs, they make us reactive when it's needed also. So, but I think what is important is that you decided that this is not the way you want to be living, that you prefer to be less reactive and, more able to choose your reactions, that you want to be less stiff and you want to be, freely moving, you want to be flexible in your mind and in your body. And I think that's the first step. You already did the first step. You realize, okay, I actually strive for a life of more freedom, flexibility, and so on, than rigidity. Yeah. And now it's just a matter of finding the right tools. And, as we keep discussing, there's like plenty of really well working tools. So that's pretty cool. And yeah, I want to repeat one more time the point that you made earlier. If one of the tools doesn't work for the moment and you're stuck, use one of the others or go to a different layer. It's like you're not progressing on an emotional level. maybe do some body work for a while, like do some exercise or whatever, and so on. And that can really unblock us sometimes, also in my experience.
Yeah, really important points. I'd say that's a good place to end it.
Nice. Then I think also it was a well roundup, and thanks for sharing about biodynamic breathwork.